Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In Nazi-occupied Paris, desperate people sought escape routes to freedom, and one man offered them salvation. Dr. Marcel Petiot presented himself as a resistance hero, helping Jews and others flee the Nazi regime. But behind the doors of his elegant townhouse at 21 Rue Le Sueur, a far more sinister operation was underway. When police investigated reports of foul-smelling smoke in 1944, they discovered a house of horrors that would expose one of France's most prolific serial killers. Tonight, we dive into the disturbing case of the doctor who turned wartime desperation into his personal killing ground. This is the story of Dr. Marcel Petiot. In the shadows of Nazi-occupied Paris, one of history's most disturbing serial killers operated under the guise of being a savior. The story of Dr. Marcel Petiot represents a particularly dark chapter in French history, where the chaos and desperation of World War II provided the perfect cover for his heinous crimes. Born in 1897 in Auxerre, France, Marcel Petiot's troubled behavior began early in life. As a child, he exhibited signs of mental instability, with reports of cruelty to animals and an inability to control his impulses. Despite these concerning behaviors, Petiot was intelligent and managed to complete medical school, becoming a physician in 1921. His early career was marked by suspicious incidents and allegations of impropriety. In Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, where he first practiced medicine, locals reported that young women who visited his practice would leave in a dazed state. There were whispers about illegal abortions and drug prescriptions, but Petiot's charismatic personality and his position as the town's mayor helped him evade serious scrutiny. The German occupation of France in 1940 created the perfect conditions for Petiot to escalate his criminal activities. Operating under the alias Dr. Eugene, he established himself as part of an escape network for people desperate to flee the Nazis. His targets were primarily wealthy Jewish families, resistance fighters, and others seeking to escape occupied France. He charged exorbitant fees, sometimes up to 250,000 francs per person, promising safe passage to Argentina or other South American countries. Petiot's house at 21 Rue Le Sueur in Paris became the final destination for many of his victims. He convinced them that they needed to be inoculated before their journey, using this pretext to inject them with lethal substances. The procedure took place in a specially prepared room where he would watch through a peephole as his victims died. Some accounts suggest he derived pleasure from observing their final moments. The doctor's scheme might have continued indefinitely if not for the smoke. On March 11, 1944, neighbors complained about thick, foul-smelling smoke emanating from his chimney. When the Paris Fire Brigade responded, they made a horrifying discovery. In the basement of Petiot's townhouse, they found human remains in various states of decomposition. Some bodies had been partially burned in his furnace, while others were decomposing in quicklime. The initial investigation revealed evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. Police found personal effects belonging to numerous victims, suitcases, clothing, and documents that people had brought with them, believing they were starting new lives abroad. In the basement, investigators discovered a soundproofed room with peepholes and restraints, where Petiot conducted his murderous activities. What made the case particularly complex was the political climate of the time. When first questioned, Petiot claimed he was a member of the French resistance, and that the bodies belonged to German soldiers and collaborators he had executed. In occupied France, where resistance activities were common, this claim needed careful investigation. The police found ledgers and documents suggesting that Petiot had methodically recorded his victims' wealth and possessions. He had created an efficient system for processing victims and disposing of their remains. The basement of his home contained quicklime pits and a furnace specially modified to burn human remains at higher temperatures. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Petiot had multiple identities and connections throughout Paris. He maintained a respectable medical practice while simultaneously operating his murder scheme. His ability to maintain these dual lives spoke to his intelligence and cunning. He had cultivated relationships with various underground networks, using these connections to identify potential victims who would not be missed. The search for Petiot himself proved challenging. When the police first discovered the bodies, he managed to escape, beginning a lengthy manhunt through Paris. He grew a beard and adopted various disguises, even joining the French forces of the interior under a false name during the liberation of Paris. During his months on the run, Petiot demonstrated remarkable adaptability. He moved between safe houses, relied on old contacts, and even participated in the resistance movement against the Germans, all while being one of the most wanted men in France. His ability to blend in and maintain composure under pressure revealed the depth of his sociopathic nature. The testimonies of those who knew him painted a picture of a man of contradictions. To his patients and neighbors, he was a caring doctor who often treated the poor for free. Yet behind this benevolent facade lurked a calculating killer who preyed on the most vulnerable during one of history's darkest periods. The investigation uncovered disturbing details about his methodology. Petiot had created a well-oiled machine for processing victims. He would first gain their trust through his medical credentials and resistance connections. Then he would convince them to liquidate their assets and bring all their valuables for the journey. Finally, he would murder them in his specially prepared room, efficiently disposing of their remains while profiting from their possessions. The scale of his operations became clearer as more evidence emerged. Police found detailed records of transactions, suggesting that Petiot had amassed considerable wealth through his crimes. He had invested in properties and businesses, using his victims' money to build a facade of legitimate success. The manhunt for Marcel Petiot finally came to an end on October 31st, 1944, at a Paris metro station. In a twist of irony, he was recognized while sitting and reading a newspaper that contained his own wanted poster. When arrested, he was found carrying a significant sum of money, false identification papers, and a revolver. His capture marked the beginning of what would become one of France's most sensational criminal trials. During his imprisonment awaiting trial, Petiot remained remarkably composed and even jovial at times. He engaged in intellectual discussions with his guards and continued to maintain his story about being a resistance fighter. Prison psychiatrists who evaluated him noted his high intelligence and his complete lack of remorse, describing him as a narcissistic psychopath with paranoid tendencies. The trial began on March 19, 1946, at the Court of Assizes in Paris, drawing massive public attention. The courthouse was packed daily with spectators, eager to catch a glimpse of the notorious doctor. Petiot appeared in court, wearing a well-tailored suit and displaying the same charismatic demeanor that had helped him lure his victims. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. The prosecution presented evidence of 27 murders, though they believed the actual number of victims could have exceeded 60. One by one, family members of the victims took the stand, describing how their loved ones had disappeared after contacting Dr. Eugene about escape routes from occupied France. Their testimonies painted a haunting picture of desperate people who had entrusted their lives and fortunes to a monster. Among the most compelling witnesses was Madame Germaine Cellier, who had narrowly escaped becoming one of Petiot's victims. She testified about meeting him to discuss passage out of France and becoming suspicious when he insisted she bring all her valuables to his house. Her instincts had saved her life, but her testimony helped seal Petiot's fate. During cross-examination, Petiot displayed remarkable composure and even arrogance. He frequently interrupted proceedings with witty remarks and challenged witnesses' testimonies. When confronted with evidence of the bodies found in his basement, he maintained his claim that they were Nazi collaborators executed as part of resistance activities, stating, "In war, one has the right to kill without the formality of a trial." The physical evidence presented at trial was overwhelming. Police investigators detailed their findings at 21 Rue Le Sueur, including photographs of the dismembered bodies, the modified furnace, and the quicklime pits. They also presented ledgers showing detailed records of victims' possessions and their estimated worth. Forensic experts testified about the chemical composition of the substances used to kill the victims, matching them to drugs that Petiot had access to as a physician. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of Petiot's former associates in the underground network. Several came forward to reveal that there had never been any legitimate escape route to South America. The entire operation had been an elaborate ruse designed to identify wealthy victims who could be easily disappeared during the chaos of war. Throughout the trial, Petiot's behavior remained consistently bizarre. He would smile at inappropriate moments, make jokes with the court officials, and sometimes break into song. When asked about specific victims, he would either deny knowing them or claim they had been German sympathizers. His apparent lack of concern for human life shocked even the most hardened courtroom observers. The prosecution methodically dismantled Petiot's resistance fighter defense. They presented evidence that many of his victims had been Jewish refugees, resistance members themselves, or ordinary citizens trying to escape the Nazi occupation. Documents showed that rather than helping the resistance, Petiot had actually profited from both sides of the conflict, sometimes selling information to German authorities while pretending to help their targets escape. The trial also revealed the extent of Petiot's earlier crimes. Witnesses from Villeneuve-sur-Yonne testified about suspicious deaths during his time as mayor there in the 1920s. Former patients came forward with stories of inappropriate behavior and questionable medical practices. The pattern of sociopathic behavior extended back decades before the war had provided him with the perfect cover for mass murder. As the trial progressed, the defense struggled to maintain any credible alternative narrative. Petiot's own testimony often contradicted itself, and his flippant attitude toward the proceedings did little to help his case. When asked about the massive amount of personal belongings found in his possession, he claimed they had been left in his care by people who had successfully escaped to South America, though he could provide no evidence of their survival. The trial lasted 17 days, during which time Petiot never showed any sign of remorse or acknowledgement of his crimes. His final statement to the court was characteristically defiant. "I am a national hero who has been misunderstood. Future generations will vindicate me." The jury took only 90 minutes to reach their verdict. On April 4, 1946, Marcel Petiot was found guilty of 26 counts of murder. The true number of his victims would never be known, as many bodies had been completely destroyed in his furnace, and wartime record-keeping was often incomplete. Some historians estimate he may have killed as many as 150 people. The court sentenced Petiot to death by guillotine, the standard method of execution in France at the time. Even after his conviction, he maintained his innocence and continued to claim he had only killed enemies of France. His appeals were quickly rejected, and the date of execution was set. On May 25, 1946, Marcel Petiot met his end at the Prison de la Santé in Paris. True to his character until the very end, he remained unnaturally calm as he was prepared for execution. When guards came to his cell at dawn, he was already awake and dressed. His final words to the prison guards were reportedly, "Gentlemen, I have one last piece of advice for you. Never admit anything." The execution was witnessed by a small group of officials and journalists. According to their accounts, Petiot walked steadily to the guillotine, showing none of the fear or remorse typically seen in condemned prisoners. At 5:05 a.m., the blade fell, bringing an end to one of France's most prolific serial killers. The aftermath of the Petiot case had lasting implications for French society. His crimes highlighted how the chaos of war could provide cover for systematic evil, and how desperate people could be exploited in their darkest hours. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about how someone like Petiot could operate so openly in occupied Paris without detection for so long. The investigation into Petiot's assets continued long after his death. Authorities worked to track down the wealth he had accumulated from his victims, much of which had been carefully hidden away. Bank accounts were discovered under various aliases, and properties purchased with his victims' money were identified. The process of returning these assets to surviving family members would continue for years. Further investigation revealed more details about his victims' final moments. According to forensic evidence, many had been injected with cyanide, causing an agonizing death that Petiot would watch through his peepholes. Others had been gassed in his soundproofed room, where he had installed a viewing window. The level of premeditation and the elaborate nature of his killing apparatus spoke to years of planning and refinement. The building at 21 Rue Le Sueur became a macabre tourist attraction in the immediate aftermath of the case. Parisians would gather outside, trying to catch a glimpse of the infamous House of Death. Eventually, the property was renovated and sold, though it retained its notorious reputation. Today, it stands as an ordinary apartment building, with many of its current residents unaware of its dark history. Petiot's wife, Georgette, and son, Gerhard, struggled to rebuild their lives after his execution. They maintained his innocence for years, claiming he had been a misunderstood patriot. Georgette would later move to the French countryside, where she lived in relative obscurity until her death. Gerhard, who was a teenager during his father's trial, would eventually leave France altogether, seeking to escape the shadow of his father's infamy. The case files from the Petiot investigation remain some of the most extensive in French criminal history. They paint a picture of methodical evil that went far beyond simple opportunistic killing. Petiot had created an elaborate system for identifying, processing, and disposing of victims, all while maintaining a respectable facade in Parisian society. Some of the most chilling evidence came from his personal writings, discovered after his death. In notebooks and journals, Petiot had recorded clinical observations about his victims' deaths, treating them as medical experiments rather than murders. These writings revealed a mind that viewed human beings as mere subjects for his deadly pursuits. The Petiot case also exposed the vulnerabilities in wartime society. Many of his victims had been forced to operate outside official channels due to their desperate circumstances, making them perfect targets. They could not go to authorities for help, could not verify Petiot's credentials, and often had no choice but to trust someone who offered hope of escape. Historical analysis of the case has drawn parallels between Petiot's methods and those of the Nazi regime he claimed to fight against. Both used the promise of relocation to lure victims. Both maintained meticulous records of their crimes, and both disposed of bodies through industrial means. The irony that Petiot used the fear of Nazi persecution to perpetrate his own Holocaust was not lost on contemporary observers. The legacy of Marcel Petiot serves as a stark reminder of how war and social upheaval can create perfect conditions for predatory individuals to operate. His case is studied by criminologists and historians as an example of how societal breakdown can enable serial killers to operate on an unprecedented scale. Today, the Petiot case remains one of the most significant criminal cases in French history, not only for the number of victims, but for what it revealed about human nature in times of crisis. It demonstrated how a respected professional could use his position and the chaos of war to become one of history's most prolific serial killers, all while maintaining an appearance of respectability. The story of Dr. Marcel Petiot continues to fascinate and horrify new generations, serving as a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk behind a respectable facade, and how desperate times can create opportunities for the worst elements of human nature to flourish. His crimes stand as a testament to the importance of maintaining vigilance and social order, even in the most challenging circumstances.